Chapter 3. Erith had the sudden and unfamiliar urge to hug her stepmother. Barely 16 years old, she was leaving the woman who had raised her. Erith's parents moved from England and settled in North Harbour shortly after she was born. They opened a post office and dry goods store in the house her father had built for his first wife. I think I should put on my glasses. That's better. They had planned to fill it with children, a dream not realized. His wife, Erith's mother Beatrice, had died in childbirth when Erith was almost 5. Kathleen, the attending midwife, married her father, Ben Lock, within the year to help raise his daughter while he was away at sea. Kathleen had not been inclined to nurture, and Aerith was sure that the woman was grateful not to have given birth herself. She often said she bore the wants of her husband because it was wifely obligation. Aerith's father was supposed to take care of his new wife and not leave her with a young child and a business to run. Now she'd get her wish and be rid of Erith. Although unspoken, Erith knew her stepmother wasn't sad that she was leaving. She had in fact made the arrangements. A step-uncle, Din Ryan, whom she barely knew beyond 2 or 3 times he came to the store over the years, needed a housekeeper in Dog Cove. Now, Dog Cove is a legitimate place. His wife had died with complications from pleurisy during the winter, leaving him with 3 children to raise. Now the fishing was underway, he had sent word to North Harbour that he needed a housekeeper, and her stepmother had volunteered Erith. Mind yourself now. Her attempt at some sort of familiarity was lost in the pinched face and harsh tone as she stood arms folded on the bottom step of the stair and looked down her nose at Erith. The grey hair that was pinned back in tight bun seemed to be trained not to get out of place, a style she had forced on Erith after her father died. Sometimes pinning it so tight, Erith's head would ache for days. Make sure you have all your clothes. She turned and went upstairs to perform a cursory check of Erith's room. Mr. Hand, a balding man in his early 40s, with one side of his dark graying hair flattened across the balding skull, poked his head through the door. "Are you ready, miss?" Erith nodded. "I'll be there shortly." She heard her stepmother at the top of the stairs. "Looks like you've got everything." Kathleen saw Mr. Hand. "She'll be right along." She dismissed him with a wave. He grabbed Erith's bag, glanced up the stairs, and nodded. The older woman ran the post office and the store, and she had added a boarding house to the business. In the winter, she usually boarded the teacher, but this past year was different. 2 men from Trinity Bay had been icebound off North Harbour Point in January after taking shelter in St. Mary's Bay during a storm. They stayed with the Locks and fixed the ice-damaged boat as soon as the weather broke. With little money to speak of, they had made a bargain with her stepmother to get wood over the winter and codfish in the spring to pay their debt. An agreement was struck, and Mr. Hand and Mr. Knopfel took up temporary residence in their large house. Today they were heading out to the fishing grounds and, along the way, landing Erith in Dog Cove. It would be cold on the water. Erith buttoned her long grey woolen coat around her plaid cotton dress. She tied the blue and white bonnet close around her pinned hair and took one last look around the kitchen. This was probably the last time she would see this place. She couldn't imagine ever coming back here. Many girls her age had a beau, but her stepmother had strongly discouraged any possibility of a love interest coming around. Her closest friend, May, had gone to St. Joseph's to keep house for a Daly family last November and hadn't returned. Erith wasn't sad about leaving, but she suddenly yearned for what could have been had her father still been alive. Her father was well respected in the community. He had been a good provider, so her neighbors said. In January 1875, he hired on as an engineer with Captain Isaac Bartlett on the steamer Tigris to go to the seal fishery. Her father and 21 others were killed when a boiler exploded while they were icebound hundreds of miles from shore. That too is a true story about the Tigris. Her father, badly burned, lived for almost a day before dying in what must have been horrific pain. Captain Bartlett had dictated a note that Erith's stepmother threw in the stove shortly after getting the news of Ben's death. Erith could barely remember being on her father's knee, right here in this kitchen, while he sang songs to her. It seemed warmer then, too. That time was a distant memory now. She didn't look back at her stepmother as she closed the porch door. The wharf, built by her father, was just a few feet from the house. Erith trod along the worn path leading down to the edge of the sod. She refused to feel scared of what was to become of her in Cove with her step-uncle and his family. She was sure she would treat the children lovingly and help them with the loss of their mother. Aerith believed herself to have a caring nature. She held her head high and stepped from the grassy embankment. The old worn sticks creaked and bent beneath her weight, but she was sure-footed and confident that they would hold her small frame. Mr. Hand helped her down the ladder into the ribbed cage of the boat. Erith caught a faint whiff of pine tar from the new oakum her stepmother had supplied to seal the joints between the frost-warped planks. Despite her efforts to hold it at bay, fear washed over her, taking her breath. She swallowed hard to recover. She was going to a new and different world, even though all she knew was the one she tolerated and was leaving behind. Mr. Naftel, a portly man in his early 30s with a crop of light brown, stringy, greasy hair, shoved the boat off from the dock. The two men grinned at each other. "Thank the Lord we're on our way," chortled Mr. Naftel. Good riddance to this place," Mr. Hand said under his breath. Both men eyed one another. Erith missed a smile on Mr. Naftel's lips as he winked at his companion. Erith sat upright on the weather-worn forward tot between the fish pounds. The boat was remarkably clean, with no sign to be seen of fish ever having been gutted or split. "How long to Cove?" "We'll be there for morning tea if we catch some wind," Hand said. Erith looked over her shoulder towards the houses on the south side of the harbour. "Might as well be the moon," she mumbled. The south side was a short row by Dory from her house, but Erith had not been there since she was a child. She barely remembered her father taking her to the garden party in the lower meadows one sunny Sunday. She acknowledged that might even be imagined, after seeing the celebrations there the last number of years. Erith's scope had since been limited to the 15 houses that dusted the north side of the harbour and the families who lived in them. Every 3 months or so, when the Roman Catholic priest came through, the residents on the south side flocked to the little church that was coming into view through the trees. "Bye, Mama. Bye, Papa," she whispered, and blessed herself when they passed the church and the graveyard. Erith looked forward to where she was headed. All the scenery was new to her as they passed the last house. They hugged the shoreline close on her right. When North Harbour Point disappeared into the sea on the left, The vast ocean opened before her. Erith marveled at the distant shore, but had no idea what communities were there. Maybe that was the one where her friend May had gone. She couldn't be sure. Mr. Hand's voice startled her. "I've been meaning to ask you where you got your name, miss." "My parents gave it to me. My father said I was named after a little town in England where my mother was born." "Your mother doesn't sound English." Erith didn't answer. The thought of the mother she hadn't known was suddenly raw on her palate. She couldn't speak as her mind flooded with a swarm of images and sounds of her father and a happier time. Instead, she gazed toward the shore, where towering cliffs rose from the ocean floor and then suddenly dropped off to show rocky beaches fold into tree-lined fields. They passed between the beach and two fishing boats from North Harbour. Mr. Walter Power and Mr. Jean Burton from North Harbour were busy hauling traps and hardly noticed their passing. A small cove came into view, and Mr. Hand dropped the sail while Mr. Knockle took up the oars. Erith looked back at the two men from her perch on the pound board. "Is this Dog Cove? Where are the houses?" "We're not going to Dog Cove," Mr. Knockle said. "We're not?" "We're not," said Hand. Erith was confused. She quickly looked back to the shore. They could be trying to play a trick on her, although she couldn't imagine why. There was nothing ahead of her that showed any sign of houses or a settlement. In the trees in the sheltered cove, a small stream splitting the land, a green patch where the grass and clover were just getting a taste of the warmth of summer, but no houses. She looked back at the two men. "So we'll be stopping here and then going to Dog Cove?" They didn't answer. "Mr. Hand?" "I'm not Hand." "And I'm not Knockle." Aerith slowly shook her head from side to side. "I don't understand." "You'll understand soon enough," the man she knew as Mr. Knockle said. Something didn't feel right, but Erith didn't know if she should be afraid. "You're dropping me off here?" "Something like that," Hand said under his breath. The boat was going too fast, and it lurched when it struck the beach. Erith lost her seating and fell hard into the pound, hitting her head on the gunwale. She was sure she saw stars and felt the sting of a bump rising near her temple. She caught a glimpse of Knockle jumping over the side of the boat. What was happening? Erith tried to make sense of the situation. "What are you doing?" asked Knockle, his eyes fixed on the man behind her. "It's a hanging offense either way," he said. As she scrambled to get her seating position, she turned, following his voice. She caught a glimpse of movement and ducked, but not in time. Hand struck her a glancing blow to the head with the blade of the oar. Erith cried out. Her arms flailed as she tried to right herself, but she tumbled over the tot into the pound, and blackness awaited.